An 8-year-old girl climbs out her bedroom window at 2 a.m. and runs to the neighbor's house after overhearing her mother's boyfriend planning to get rid of the kids. When she shows the neighbor the threatening text messages she photographed, the neighbor immediately calls 911. The digital clock on Ruby Martinez's nightstand glowed 1:47 a.m. in harsh red numbers, casting eerie shadows across her small bedroom. She lay perfectly still beneath her worn purple comforter, brown eyes wide, open and alert, listening to the muffled voices drifting up from the living room below. At 8 years old, Ruby had already learned that nighttime conversations between adults often revealed truths that daylight carefully concealed. The single-story house on Elm Street had thin walls and creaky floors that betrayed every footstep, every raised voice, every slammed cabinet door. Ruby knew the sounds of this house like a musician knows scales. The particular groan of the third floorboard in the hallway, the way the kitchen faucet wheezed when turned too quickly, the distinct thud of Derek's heavy work boots being kicked off near the front door after he had been drinking. Tonight, those boots had hit the floor with particular violence around midnight. Ruby pulled the comforter up to her chin and turned slightly toward her bedroom door, which she always kept cracked open just enough to hear what was happening in the rest of the house. This habit had developed over the past 6 months, since Derek Walsh had become a permanent fixture in their lives. Her mother, Carmen, called him her boyfriend, but Ruby had noticed that adults often use gentle words to describe harsh realities. The house itself seemed to hold its breath during these late-night hours. Built in the 1960s, it was a modest ranch-style home with white aluminum siding that had begun to yellow with age and 3 small bedrooms connected by a narrow hallway that led to the main living area. Ruby's room was at the far end of the hall, painted a pale pink that had been cheerful when they first moved in 3 years ago, but now seemed faded and tired. The walls were decorated with drawings she had made in school, colorful pictures of houses with smoking chimneys and stick-figure families holding hands under bright yellow suns. Looking at those drawings now, Ruby could barely remember feeling optimistic enough to imagine such happy scenes. Derek was a large man with calloused hands and a voice that could fill a room even when he was not trying to be loud. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that strained against the flannel shirts he wore to his job at the construction company. His brown hair was already thinning at 28, and he had a beard that he kept neatly trimmed but which somehow always made him look older and more intimidating than he probably intended. When he first started coming around, he would bring Ruby and her 5-year-old brother Miguel small gifts, candy bars from the gas station, coloring books with cartoon characters on the covers, a stuffed bear that smelled like cigarettes, and aftershave. He would ruffle Ruby's dark hair with those big hands and call her kiddo in a voice that seemed friendly enough, though there was always something performative about his kindness, as if he were acting out a role he had seen in movies, rather than expressing genuine affection. But Ruby had always been an observant child, forced by circumstance to read the subtle changes in adult moods and behaviors that determined whether a day would be peaceful or filled with tension. Her father had left when Miguel was barely 2 years old, disappearing one Tuesday morning while Carmen was at work and leaving behind only a note saying he was not ready for the responsibility of being a parent. Ruby had been 5 then, old enough to understand that her father was gone, but too young to understand why. The experience had taught her to watch carefully for signs that the adults in her life were preparing to leave or change in ways that might hurt her and Miguel. Over the months, Derek's visits had become longer, his presence more oppressive. He had started staying overnight, then moving his clothes into Carmen's bedroom, then treating the house as if he owned it. He would rearrange furniture without asking, throw away toys he considered too childish or too noisy, and establish rules about when Ruby and Miguel were allowed to be in the living room or kitchen. The small gifts had stopped coming. The friendly voice had developed an edge, especially after Derek had been drinking, which seemed to happen more and more frequently. Derek's drinking was not the stumbling, obvious drunkenness that Ruby had seen in movies. Instead, it was a gradual progression that started with 1 beer during dinner and continued throughout the evening, until his voice became louder, his movements less controlled, and his patience with children's questions or needs completely exhausted. He would sit in front of the television with a growing collection of empty beer cans arranged on the coffee table like soldiers, watching shows about men fixing cars or building houses or hunting animals in the wilderness. During these hours, he would make cutting comments about everything from the cost of groceries to Carmen's cooking, to the noise Ruby and Miguel made when they played. Carmen worked double shifts at Rosie's diner on the other side of Millbrook, serving coffee and pie to truckers and late-night customers who left small tips and smaller smiles. The diner was a 24-hour establishment with cracked vinyl, booths and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and pale. Carmen had been working there for 4 years, ever since Ruby's father left, and she realized that her high school diploma and limited work experience would not be enough to support 2 children on her own. She would leave for work at 5 in the evening wearing her pink uniform with Carmen embroidered in cursive letters above the pocket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her face already showing the exhaustion that came from trying to be cheerful for customers while worrying about bills and childcare, and whether Derek would remember to make sure the kids ate dinner. She would not return until nearly 7 in the morning, exhausted and smelling of grease and industrial cleaning solution, her feet aching from standing for 12 hours and her uniform stained with coffee and ketchup and the general wear of a long night's work. During those long nighttime hours, Derek was supposed to watch Ruby and Miguel, but his idea of supervision involved little more than making sure they stayed in their rooms and did not bother him while he watched television and drank beer. Ruby had learned to take care of Miguel during these hours, becoming his surrogate parent in ways that no 8-year-old should have to be. She would help him with his bath, making sure the water was not too hot and that he used soap on all the important parts. She would read him stories from the picture books they had borrowed from the school library, using different voices for the characters, and making up additional adventures when the official stories were too short to help him fall asleep. She would check on him during the night if he had bad dreams, whispering reassurances and sometimes letting him sleep in her bed if he was too frightened to stay in his own room. Miguel was a sweet child with their mother's dark eyes and an innocent trust in the world that Ruby both envied and felt compelled to protect. He was small for his age, with a gap-toothed smile and a habit of asking endless questions about everything from why birds could fly to where their father had gone to, why. Derek seemed angry so much of the time. Ruby had become expert at deflecting these questions with activities or stories or simple explanations that satisfied Miguel's curiosity without forcing her to articulate the fears and uncertainties that kept her awake at night. The house on Elm Street sat in a quiet neighborhood where most families had lived for decades. The streets were lined with mature oak and maple trees that provided generous shade in the summer and turned brilliant colors in the fall before dropping their leaves in thick carpets that neighborhood children loved to jump in. Most of the houses were similar in size and style to Ruby's, built during the post-war boom when Millbrook was expanding from a small farming community into a proper suburb. The families who lived here were working-class people, mechanics and teachers and store clerks who mowed their lawns on weekends and decorated their houses with seasonal wreaths and knew each other's children by name. The Pattersons had been next door for 30 years before Mr. Patterson passed away 2 summers ago, leaving Eleanor Patterson to tend her garden alone and wave to the neighborhood children from her front porch. Mrs. Patterson was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair that she kept in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that were always slightly crooked. She had worked as a librarian at the elementary school until her retirement, and her house reflected her love of books and learning. The front porch was decorated with wind chimes and hanging plants, and Ruby could often see her in the evening sitting in her rocking chair with a paperback novel and a cup of tea. Mrs. Patterson had always been gentle with Ruby and Miguel, offering them fresh cookies when they walked past her house and asking about school with genuine interest that made Ruby feel like her answers actually mattered to someone. She would comment on Ruby's drawings when Ruby showed them to her, pointing out details and asking questions that demonstrated she was really looking at the artwork rather than just offering polite adult praise. Mrs. Patterson had clapped from her porch and called out congratulations that made him beam with pride for the rest of the day. Ruby often wondered if Mrs. Patterson could hear the raised voices from their house at night, if she noticed the way Carmen's smiles had become more forced over the past months, if she saw how Derek's truck would sometimes sit in their driveway for days at a time while Carmen's old Honda remained at the diner parking lot. But adults had their own complicated ways of minding their business and not asking questions that might require difficult answers. Ruby had learned that grown-ups were often willing to ignore problems that were inconvenient or uncomfortable to acknowledge, especially when those problems belonged to other people's families. Tonight felt different, though. There was an urgency in Derek's voice that Ruby had not heard before, a sharp anger that cut through the usual grumble of his complaints about money and work and the general unfairness of his life. Earlier that evening, he had been more agitated than usual, pacing around the kitchen while Carmen got ready for work and making comments about bills and expenses and how hard it was to get ahead when you were supporting other people's children. Carmen had tried to soothe him with promises that her next paycheck would be bigger because she was picking up extra shifts, but Derek had brushed off her reassurances with a wave of his hand that suggested he had moved beyond simple financial concerns into some deeper territory of resentment and anger. Ruby strained to make out the words, but the television was too loud, and Derek's speech was slurred with alcohol. She could hear the rise and fall of his voice, the occasional curse word, and the sound of beer cans being crushed and tossed aside. Something about his tone made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety, the same feeling she got when she heard adults arguing about things that might affect her and Miguel's safety or security. She slipped quietly out of bed, her bare feet silent, on the worn carpet that had once been cream-colored, but was now a dingy beige that showed every stain and footprint. The floorboards beneath the carpet were solid and did not creak, which was fortunate because Ruby had learned to move through the house silently during Derek's evening drinking sessions. She crept to her bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, and peered down the hallway toward the living room. The hallway was dark, except for the bluish glow of the television screen flickering against the far wall, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that made the familiar space feel strange and somehow threatening. Ruby could see part of the living room from her vantage point, the arm of the brown leather couch that Derek had brought with him when he moved in, the coffee table with its collection of empty beer cans, and Derek's legs stretched out as he sprawled across the cushions. From the sound of his voice, he was on the phone with someone, and his tone was more animated than usual, as if the alcohol had loosened his tongue and allowed him to express thoughts he normally kept to himself. "You don't understand the situation." "I'm in here," Derek was saying, his words thick and angry but still clear enough for Ruby to make out each syllable. "She's got these 2 kids hanging around all the time, eating food, making noise, getting in the way of everything. I can't even have a conversation with Carmen without them interrupting or needing something." Ruby pressed herself against the door frame, her heart beginning to beat faster as she realized he was talking about her and Miguel. The tone of his voice made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. But there was something else there too, a coldness that she had not heard before, as if he were discussing a problem that needed to be solved rather than talking about children who lived in his house. "I've tried being nice to them, but kids that age don't respect anything," Derek continued, taking what sounded like a long drink from his beer. "They just take and never give anything back. And Carmen, she's so tired from work that she doesn't even see how they manipulate her, always wanting attention and money for school stuff and new clothes. Every time she gets a little bit ahead, something comes up with one of the kids, and there goes the money." Derek paused, presumably listening to whoever was on the other end of the phone. Ruby could hear him shifting on the couch, the leather creaking under his weight. She remained frozen in place, afraid to move closer, but desperate to hear every word of this conversation that seemed to be about her family's future. "The thing is, I really care about Carmen," Derek said after a moment, his voice taking on a tone that Ruby had heard him use when he was trying to convince her mother of something. "She's a good woman, works hard, doesn't ask for much. But she comes with all this baggage, you know? These kids that aren't even mine. And I'm supposed to just accept that they're part of the package. I'm supposed to pay for their food and put up with their noise and pretend like I'm some kind of father figure when all I want is to build a life with their mother. Ruby felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had always known that. Derek did not particularly like her and Miguel, but hearing him talk about them as obstacles to be removed made her feel sick and frightened in a way she could not fully articulate. The casual cruelty of his words was more shocking than if he had simply been angry or mean. This was cold calculation, a grown man discussing children as if they were problems that needed to be eliminated rather than human beings who deserved love and protection. I keep thinking there's got to be a solution here, Derek continued, his voice growing more agitated as he warmed to his subject. Some way to make this work without having to deal with constant kid drama. Carmen's ex-husband took off years ago, so it's not like there's anywhere else for them to go. But I swear, sometimes I think about what my life would be like if it was just me and Carmen. No complications, no extra mouths to feed, no little voices interrupting every conversation we try to have. The word solution hung in the air like a threat, and Ruby felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the October night air seeping through the old windows. She had seen enough movies and television shows to know that when adults talked about finding solutions to problems involving children, those solutions rarely involved the children's best interests. Derek's conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which Ruby learned more about his resentment and frustration than she had ever wanted to know. He complained about the cost of feeding two growing children, about the noise they made when they played, about the way they monopolized Carmen's attention and energy. He talked about his own childhood in foster care after his mother died and his father abandoned him, describing it in terms that made it sound like a cautionary tale rather than a tragedy. Most disturbing of all, he began to speak hypothetically about what might happen if Carmen were forced to choose between her children and her relationship with him. "She depends on me now," Derek said with satisfaction that chilled Ruby to the bone. "She can't afford this place on her own, can't manage. Two kids without help. If I left, she'd probably have to move back in with her mother in that tiny apartment, or maybe even give up the kids to social services. But if the kids weren't in the picture, we could get a nice place together, maybe even get married, start fresh without all this baggage from her past." When Derek finally hung up the phone, Ruby heard him stumble to the kitchen, presumably to get another beer from the refrigerator. She quickly and silently returned to her bed, pulling the covers up and closing her eyes tightly, though she knew sleep would not come easily after what she had just heard. As she lay there in the darkness, Ruby's mind raced with questions and fears she was too young to fully process, but old enough to understand were serious. What did Derek mean by finding a solution? What would happen if Carmen had to choose between Derek and her children? Where would she and Miguel go if Derek convinced their mother that they were too much trouble to keep around? For the first time in her 8 years, Ruby truly understood that the adults in her life might not be able to protect her and Miguel. The realization was terrifying and somehow strangely clarifying. If the grown-ups could not keep them safe, she would have to find a way to do it herself. The clock now read 2:23 a.m., and Derek had finally gone quiet in the living room. Ruby could hear his heavy breathing, which meant he had probably fallen asleep on the couch again with the television still flickering. In a few hours, Carmen would come home exhausted from her shift, find Derek passed out with empty beer cans scattered around him, and probably just step quietly around him to avoid starting an argument before she had to sleep for a few hours and then get ready for her next shift. This had become their routine, their careful dance around Derek's moods and drinking, and the growing tension that filled their small house like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Carmen would tiptoe around Derek's sleeping form, gather up the empty beer cans, turn off the television, and cover him with the throw blanket from the back of the couch. She would check on Ruby and Miguel, kissing their foreheads softly and whispering that she loved them before collapsing into her own bed for a few hours of restless sleep. But tonight, Something had shifted. Tonight, Ruby had heard Derek talk about her and Miguel, as if they were problems that needed to be eliminated, and she knew with the frightening clarity that sometimes comes to children in dangerous situations, that things were about to get much worse before they got better. She closed her eyes and tried to make a plan, though she was not sure what kind of plan an 8-year-old could make that would protect her little brother and herself from an adult who had already decided they did not belong in his version of the family. She thought about the emergency bag she kept hidden under her bed, a small backpack containing clean clothes for her and Miguel, some crackers she had saved from school lunches, and the $23 she had accumulated from birthday gifts and loose change found around the house. She had packed this bag months ago, acting on an instinct she could not fully explain, but which now seemed prophetic. Outside her window, Millbrook slept peacefully under a canopy of autumn stars, unaware that in the small house on Elm Street, a little girl was learning that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who live in your own home and smile at your mother during the day. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood, and Ruby could see the warm glow from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window, where the kind woman was probably having her late-night cup of tea and reading one of her mystery novels. Ruby thought about Mrs. Patterson's gentle questions about school, and her genuine interest in Ruby's drawings, and her way of listening that made children feel like their words mattered. For a moment, she wondered what would happen if she knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door right now and told her what she had overheard. Would the older woman believe her? Would she know what to do? Or would she, like most adults, find ways to explain away Ruby's concerns and send her back home to deal with problems that seemed too complicated for grown-ups to acknowledge? As sleep finally began to claim her exhausted mind, Ruby made a promise to herself and to Miguel, who was sleeping peacefully in the room next to hers, unaware that his 8-year-old sister was the only thing standing between him and a man who saw him as an obstacle to be removed. Whatever Derek was planning, whatever solution he thought he had found to the problem of Carmen's children, Ruby would be ready. She would protect Miguel the way their mother should have been protecting both of them, and she would find a way to keep them safe, even if it meant doing things that 8-year-old girls were not supposed to have to do. The house settled into the deep quiet of the small hours, but Ruby's mind remained alert, already beginning to formulate the desperate plan that would soon change everything for their small, fractured family. The next evening arrived with the same oppressive weight that had settled over the house on Elm Street like a thick blanket. Ruby had spent the entire day at school unable to concentrate on her third-grade lessons, her mind replaying Derek's phone conversation from the night before. Every time her teacher, Miss Henderson, called on her to answer a question about multiplication tables or reading comprehension, Ruby found herself staring blankly ahead, her thoughts consumed by the cold calculation in Derek's voice when he had spoken about finding a solution to the problem of Carmen's children. During lunch, she had sat at her usual table with her friend Jessica Martinez, no relation despite sharing a last name, picking at her peanut butter sandwich while Jessica chattered about the upcoming Halloween costume contest and whether Ruby wanted to come trick-or-treating in Jessica's neighborhood, which had bigger houses and supposedly gave out full-size candy bars. Ruby had nodded and made appropriate responses, but her heart was not in the conversation. How could she explain to Jessica that she was worried about much more serious things than Halloween costumes? How could an 8-year-old tell her friend that she was afraid the man living in her house might be planning to hurt her and her little brother? When the final bell rang at 3:15, Ruby had walked home slowly, taking the long route that led past the public library and the small park where she and Miguel sometimes played on weekends when Carmen was home and Derek was in a good mood. She found herself looking at other families she passed on the street, mothers pushing strollers, fathers throwing footballs with their sons, older siblings walking protectively beside younger ones, and wondering if any of them had to worry about the kinds of things that kept her awake at night. The Martinez house looked deceptively normal from the outside, with its white aluminum siding and small front yard bordered by the chain-link fence that Mr. Patterson had helped install years before his death. Carmen's old Honda Civic was not in the driveway, which meant she had already left for her evening shift at Rosie's Diner. Derek's beat-up Ford pickup truck sat where it always did, taking up most of the narrow driveway and leaking small puddles of oil onto the cracked concrete. Ruby found Derek in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a beer in one hand and a stack of papers spread out in front of him. These were Carmen's financial documents, bank statements, bills, and the small notebook where she kept track of their monthly expenses in her careful handwriting. Derek was not supposed to go through these papers when Carmen was not home, but over the past few months he had become increasingly bold about treating her personal belongings as if they were his own property. "Your mother needs to learn how to manage money better," Derek said, without looking up when Ruby entered the kitchen. His voice was already slightly slurred, which meant this was not his first beer of the day. "Look at this mess. Rent, utilities, groceries, car payment, and that's before we even get to all the extra stuff you kids need. School supplies, clothes, doctor visits. It never ends." Ruby set her backpack down carefully by the kitchen table and watched as Derek shuffled through Carmen's private papers with increasing agitation. She wanted to tell him that those documents did not belong to him, that Carmen worked 2 jobs specifically so she could pay those bills and take care of her children. But she had learned that contradicting Derek when he was drinking often led to arguments that made the entire house feel unsafe. "Where's Miguel?" she asked instead, noticing that her little brother was not in the living room watching his afternoon cartoons as usual. "In his room, playing with those noisy trucks," Derek replied with obvious irritation. "I told him to keep it down because I have important things to think about. Your mother and I need to make some serious decisions about this family's future, and I can't concentrate with constant noise from toy cars crashing into walls." Ruby felt her stomach tighten at the mention of decisions about their family's future. After what she had overheard the night before, any conversation about changes in their living situation felt like a potential threat. She excused herself and went to check on Miguel, finding him in his small bedroom sitting cross-legged on the floor with his collection of toy cars and trucks arranged in careful lines. He was making quiet engine noises under his breath, clearly trying to play while following Derek's instructions to keep the sound down. "Hi, Ruby." Miguel looked up with a gap-toothed smile that never failed to make her heart ache with protective love. "I'm building a highway for my cars. Do you want to help me make a bridge out of my books?" For a few minutes, Ruby allowed herself to be distracted by Miguel's innocent enthusiasm, helping him construct elaborate roadways using his picture books and building blocks. Miguel chatted happily about his day at kindergarten, telling her about the letter of the week and the song they were learning about autumn leaves and how his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had complimented his drawing of their family, a stick figure, portrait that included Carmen, Ruby, Miguel, and notably, no Derek. "I drew us at the park," Miguel explained, showing Ruby the construction paper artwork he had brought home in his backpack. "Remember when Mama took us to feed the ducks? That was the best day ever." Ruby remembered that day from 3 months ago, before Derek had become a permanent fixture in their lives. Carmen had had a rare Saturday off from the diner, and they had spent the afternoon at Miller's Pond, sharing a picnic lunch and watching the ducks paddle around the small lake. Carmen had seemed relaxed and happy in a way that Ruby rarely saw anymore, laughing at Miguel's excited commentary about the different types of birds and helping Ruby collect interesting rocks along the shoreline. It had been a perfect day, the kind of memory that seemed to belong to a different family entirely. "Maybe we can go back there soon," Ruby said, though she was not sure she believed it. Derek did not like activities that took Carmen's attention away from him, and he certainly did not enjoy spending money on things like park visits or duck feeding expeditions that he considered frivolous wastes of time and resources. Around 6 o'clock. Ruby heard Derek's voice get louder in the kitchen, followed by the sound of chair legs scraping against the linoleum floor. She left Miguel playing with his cars and crept down the hallway to see what was happening. Derek was pacing back and forth between the kitchen counter and the refrigerator, talking on his cell phone with increasing agitation while he gestured at Carmen's financial papers with his free hand. "I'm telling you, the numbers don't add up." Derek was saying to whoever was on the other end of the call. She makes decent money at that diner, especially with the double shifts, but every penny goes to kid expenses, school stuff, food, clothes, medical bills when one of them gets sick. There's never anything left over for us to actually build a life together. Ruby pressed herself against the hallway wall, her heart beginning to race as she realized this might be a continuation of the conversation she had overheard the night before. Derek's tone was different this time, less philosophical, and more urgent, as if he had moved from considering options to actually planning a course of action. "She's completely devoted to those kids," Derek continued, taking a long drink from his beer. "I mean, I get it. They're her children and all that. But she can't see how they're holding her back, holding us back. Every time we start to get ahead, financially, something comes up with one of them, and boom, there goes the money we could have used for our own place, our own future." Derek paused to listen to the person on the other end of the call, nodding vigorously, even though the other person could not see him. Ruby strained to catch any hint of what the other voice was saying, but Derek's phone was pressed too tightly against his ear for her to make out any words. "That's exactly what I've been thinking," Derek said after a moment, his voice taking on an excited quality that made Ruby's skin crawl. "If the kids weren't in the picture, Carmen and I could get married, find a nice apartment, maybe even start our own family eventually. But as long as she's tied down with these two, she'll never be able to commit fully to our relationship." Ruby felt tears begin to sting her eyes as she listened to Derek casually discuss the elimination of her and Miguel from their mother's life, as if they were discussing the removal of unwanted furniture. The callousness of his words was breathtaking. But even more terrifying was the methodical way he was thinking through the logistics of separating Carmen from her children. "The thing is, Carmen's too soft-hearted to make the hard choices herself," Derek continued, beginning to pace more rapidly around the kitchen. "She feels guilty about their father leaving, so she overcompensates by trying to be both mother and father to them. She doesn't see that sometimes you have to choose between the past and the future, between holding on to baggage and moving forward with your life." Derek's voice was getting louder and more animated as he spoke, and Ruby realized with growing alarm that he was not just venting his frustrations to a friend. This sounded like a man who was actively planning something, working through the details of a scheme that would somehow remove her and Miguel from Carmen's life permanently. "Social services gets involved in these situations all the time," Derek said, and Ruby felt her blood turn to ice. "Kids get taken away from parents who can't provide adequate care, who work too many hours to properly supervise them, who live in unstable housing situations. It happens every day, and sometimes it's actually the best thing for everyone involved." Ruby had to cover her mouth with her hand to keep from making a sound that would reveal her presence in the hallway. The idea that Derek might be planning to call social services and report Carmen as an unfit mother was so horrific that she could barely process it. She knew that Carmen loved her and Miguel more than anything in the world, that every double shift and every sacrifice was made specifically to keep their small family together and safe. "Once they're in the system, they'd probably get placed with foster families pretty quickly," Derek continued with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Young kids, especially siblings, they usually find homes faster than teenagers. And Carmen would be devastated at first, but she'd eventually realize that she couldn't have provided for them properly anyway. She'd see that this gives her a chance to start over, to build the kind of life she really wants instead of just surviving day to day." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, during which Derek outlined his plan with increasing detail and enthusiasm. He talked about documentation he could provide showing Carmen's long work hours and frequent absences from home. He discussed the house's cramped conditions and the fact that Ruby and Miguel were often left in his care during overnight hours. He even mentioned the emergency bag that Ruby kept hidden under her bed, suggesting that this showed the children felt unsafe in their current living situation. Ruby realized with growing horror that Derek had been observing and cataloging details about their family life for weeks, or possibly months, building a case against Carmen that would paint her as a neglectful mother who prioritized work over her children's well-being. The fact that Carmen worked those long hours specifically to support Ruby and Miguel would be twisted into evidence that she was not present enough to provide adequate supervision and care. "The beautiful part is that Carmen won't blame me," Derek said with satisfaction that made Ruby feel physically sick. "She'll think it's just bad luck, or maybe that some busybody neighbor reported her. She'll be too upset and confused to think clearly about who might have called social services, and by the time she realizes what happened, the kids will already be settled somewhere else, and she'll have had time to see how much better her life is without them." When Derek finally ended the call, Ruby heard him walk to the refrigerator and pull out another beer. She quickly and silently retreated to Miguel's room, where her little brother was still playing contentedly with his toy cars, completely unaware that the man in their kitchen was actively planning to destroy their family. "Ruby, are you okay?" Miguel asked, looking up at her with concern. "You look sad." Ruby knelt down beside him and pulled him into a tight hug, breathing in the familiar scent of his strawberry-scented shampoo and the faint smell of crayons that always seemed to cling to his clothes. "I'm fine, buddy. I'm just thinking about stuff." "What kind of stuff?" "Grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But even as she said the words, Ruby knew that Miguel did need to worry, that they both needed to worry more than any children should ever have to. Derek was not just complaining about their presence in his life anymore. He was actively planning to remove them from Carmen's life permanently, and he was methodical and calculating enough to make his plan work. As the evening progressed, Derek's drinking continued and his mood became increasingly volatile. He complained loudly about the noise when Miguel's toy cars made clicking sounds against the floor. He criticized the dinner Ruby had prepared for herself and Miguel. Simple, sandwiches and apple slices that required no cooking skills, but which Derek declared inadequate nutrition for growing children. Everything Ruby and Miguel did seemed to irritate him, as if their very existence in the house was a personal affront that he could barely tolerate. Around 10 o'clock, Ruby tucked Miguel into bed with his favorite stuffed elephant, reading him a story about a brave little mouse who saved his family from danger. As she read the words about courage and determination and never giving up when people you love are in trouble, Ruby felt as if the story was speaking directly to her own situation. "Ruby," Miguel said sleepily, as she was about to turn off his, bedroom light. "Why doesn't Derek like us?" The question hit Ruby like a physical blow, partly because it confirmed that Miguel had noticed Derek's hostility despite her efforts to shield him from it, and partly because she had no idea how to answer honestly without terrifying him. "Some grown-ups have trouble adjusting when families change," she said carefully. "It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. But Mama loves us, right?" "Mama loves us more than anything in the whole world," Ruby said firmly. And she knew this was absolutely true, even if everything else in their lives felt uncertain and dangerous. After Miguel fell asleep, Ruby returned to her own room and lay in bed, listening to Derek move around the house below. She could hear him talking on the phone again, his voice occasionally rising in animated conversation. Around midnight, she heard the familiar sounds of him settling onto the living room couch, with the television turned up louder than necessary. At 1:30 a.m., Derek's phone rang, and Ruby heard him answer with the eager tone of someone who had been waiting for an important call. "Yeah, I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier," Derek said, his words slightly slurred but still clear enough for Ruby to understand from her position at the cracked bedroom door. "I think tomorrow night might be the right time to make the call. Carmen's working a double shift, won't be home until morning, and I can document that the kids are left alone for hours at a time." Ruby felt her heart begin to pound so hard she was afraid Derek might hear it from downstairs. Tomorrow night, that meant Derek was planning to call social services within 24 hours to set in motion the process that would separate her and Miguel from Carmen permanently. "I've got everything documented," Derek continued. "Photos of the kids' messy rooms, receipts showing how much money Carmen spends on child-related expenses, notes about the times they've been left in my care overnight. I can make it look like she's overwhelmed and unable to provide proper supervision." Derek paused, presumably listening to the other person's response. Ruby strained to catch any hint of what advice or encouragement he was receiving, but she could only hear Derek's side of the conversation. "The thing is, once social services gets involved, there's no going back," Derek said with something that sounded almost like excitement. "They'll interview the kids, inspect the house, review Carmen's work schedule and financial situation. Even if she tries to make changes, it'll be too late. The system doesn't like to return kids to situations they've already determined are unstable." Ruby realized that Derek was not just planning to make a false report. He was planning to manufacture evidence that would support his claims about Carmen's inadequate parenting. The photos and receipts and notes he mentioned would be carefully selected and presented to make Carmen look like a neglectful mother who prioritized work over her children's well-being. Derek's phone conversation continued for nearly an hour, during which Ruby learned more details about his plan than she ever wanted to know. He had researched the social services reporting process, identified the specific complaints that were most likely to trigger an immediate investigation, and even practiced the story he would tell about being a concerned family friend who had reluctantly decided to report a dangerous situation involving 2 young children. "By this time next week, Carmen will be free to focus on our relationship, without all the complications," Derek said with obvious satisfaction. "She'll be upset at first, but once she realizes how much easier her life is without constant kid drama, she'll thank me for helping her make the hard choice she couldn't make herself." When Derek finally ended the call, Ruby heard him get up from the couch and stumble toward the kitchen. This was her chance, possibly her only chance, to gather the evidence she needed to protect her family from Derek's plan. Moving as quietly as she possibly could, Ruby slipped out of her bedroom and crept down the hallway toward the living room. Derek was in the kitchen, and she could hear him rummaging through the refrigerator, probably looking for another beer. His cell phone was lying on the coffee table next to the couch, the screen still glowing faintly in the dim light from the television. Ruby's heart was beating so hard she was sure Derek would hear it, but she forced herself to move carefully and deliberately. She picked up Derek's phone with trembling hands, grateful that he had not bothered to set up a passcode lock. The screen showed his recent call log, text messages, and various apps, but Ruby was not sure how to access the evidence she needed. She quickly looked around the room and spotted the family tablet lying on the bookshelf where Carmen sometimes left it after paying bills online. Ruby grabbed the tablet, turned it on, and opened the camera app. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the devices steady, but she managed to take several photos of Derek's phone screen, including his recent calls and text message conversations. As she scrolled through Derek's text messages, Ruby discovered conversations that were even more horrifying than what she had overheard on his phone calls. There were detailed discussions about the best way to make Carmen look like an unfit mother, suggestions for documentation that would support a social services complaint, and even research about what happened to children who were removed from their homes and placed in foster care. One text thread was particularly chilling. Derek had been exchanging messages with someone who seemed to be advising him on the social services reporting process, and their conversation included specific details about how to make false claims sound credible and believable. "Tomorrow night is perfect timing," read one of Derek's messages. "Carmen will be at work, kids will be here with me overnight. I can call and report that she regularly leaves them unsupervised for 12-hour periods. Social services will have to investigate immediately." The response message was equally disturbing. "Make sure you mention specific safety concerns. Talk about inadequate food, lack of supervision, kids feeling unsafe. That will trigger an emergency removal." Ruby photographed as many of these text messages as she could, her hands trembling with fear and adrenaline. She was barely 8 years old, but she understood with perfect clarity that these messages were evidence of Derek's plan to destroy her family, and that this might be the only proof she could provide to adults who might be able to help them. From the kitchen, Ruby heard Derek's footsteps approaching, and she quickly closed Derek's phone and the tablet, placing both devices back where she had found them. She scurried silently back to her bedroom, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy and nauseated. Once safely back in her room, Ruby turned on the tablet again and scrolled through the photos she had taken. The text of Derek's messages was clearly visible, and even though some of the images were slightly blurry due to her shaking hands, the content was readable and unmistakably incriminating. As she looked at the evidence she had gathered, Ruby realized that she now possessed proof of Derek's plan to falsely report Carmen to social services. But she also understood that having evidence was only the first step. She still needed to figure out how to use this information to protect her family before Derek could put his plan into action. Tomorrow night, Derek intended to make the call that would set in motion the destruction of everything Ruby and Miguel held dear. She had less than 24 hours to find a way to stop him. And she knew with frightening certainty that she could not count on any of the adults in her life to recognize the danger or take action quickly enough to prevent it. For the second night in a row, Ruby lay awake in the darkness, but this time she was not just afraid. She was planning. She had evidence of Derek's intentions. She had a growing understanding of how dangerous he really was, and she had the desperate determination that comes to children who realize they must save themselves and the people they love. Outside her window, Millbrook slept peacefully under the same autumn stars, unaware that in the small house on Elm Street, an 8-year-old girl was preparing to take on an adult who had already proven he would do anything to get what he wanted, even if it meant destroying the lives of 2 innocent children and the mother who loved them more than her own life. The following evening arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down on the house like a heavy blanket. Ruby had barely been able to concentrate during her classes at school, her mind consumed with the knowledge that Derek planned to make his devastating phone call to social services that very night. Every time she looked at the classroom clock, she felt her anxiety increase as the hours ticked by toward what she now thought of as the deadline for her family's destruction. At lunch, Jessica had asked her 3 times if she was feeling sick, noting that Ruby looked pale and had dark circles under her eyes. Ruby had managed to deflect her friend's concern with vague explanations about not sleeping well, but the truth was that she had lain awake most of the previous night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what she could possibly do to stop Derek's plan from succeeding. The tablet containing the photographs of Derek's incriminating text messages was hidden under her mattress, but Ruby knew that simply having evidence would not be enough if Derek succeeded in convincing social services that Carmen was an unfit mother. Once the system became involved, it would be too late for explanations or evidence of Derek's manipulation. Ruby had heard enough stories from classmates who had been placed in foster care to know that the process of family separation could happen very quickly, sometimes within hours of the initial report. When the final school bell rang at 3:15 p.m., Ruby walked home with unusual slowness, taking the longest possible route and stopping at every crosswalk even when there was no traffic. She was not eager to face what she knew would be Derek's final preparations for his plan, and she was terrified of what the evening might bring. The house looked exactly the same as always from the outside. White aluminum siding, small front yard, Derek's beat-up truck in the driveway. But Ruby felt as if she were approaching a place that had become fundamentally dangerous, a trap that was about to spring closed on her family. Inside, she found Derek in an unusually good mood, whistling softly as he moved around the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a more elaborate dinner than usual. He had made hamburgers and French fries, opened a bag of pre-made salad, and even set the table with the good plates that Carmen usually reserved for special occasions. "There's my favorite girl," Derek said with a smile that did not reach his eyes when Ruby entered the kitchen. "I thought we should have a nice family dinner tonight, just the 3 of us. Your mom's working late again, but that gives us a chance to spend some quality time together." Ruby felt her stomach clench at Derek's false cheerfulness, but she managed to respond with a polite thank you and went to find Miguel, who was in the living room building an elaborate castle out of his wooden blocks. Her little brother looked up with his usual gap-toothed grin, completely unaware that this might be one of the last normal evenings they would spend in their home. "Derek made hamburgers," Miguel announced excitedly. "He said we can eat them while watching cartoons if we promise to be neat." This was highly unusual behavior from Derek, who normally insisted that meals be eaten at the kitchen table in complete silence while he watched the news or sports. Ruby recognized this sudden kindness as part of Derek's preparation for the evening ahead. He was establishing a narrative of himself as a caring parental figure who went out of his way to provide special treats for Carmen's children. During dinner, Derek kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Ruby about her schoolwork and Miguel about his kindergarten activities with an attentiveness that would have seemed caring to any outside observer. He complimented Ruby on her grades, praised Miguel's latest artwork, and even suggested they might go to the park together over the weekend if the weather was nice. But Ruby could see through the performance to the cold calculation underneath. Derek was practicing the role of the concerned family friend who had reluctantly concluded that Carmen's work schedule prevented her from adequately supervising her children. Every kind word and caring gesture was being mentally catalogued as evidence of his own positive influence in their lives, which would make his eventual betrayal seem more credible and heart-wrenching. "Your mom works so hard to take care of you two," Derek said as they finished eating, his voice taking on a tone of exaggerated concern. "Sometimes I worry that she's pushing herself too hard, that all these double shifts are taking a toll on her ability to be present for the important moments in your lives." Ruby felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized this as a rehearsal for the story Derek would tell social services, the narrative of a devoted mother who had unfortunately allowed work obligations to interfere with proper child supervision. After dinner, Derek insisted on helping Ruby and Miguel with their evening routines, supervising Miguel's bath, and even reading him a bedtime story with theatrical voices that made Miguel giggle with delight. To any outside observer, Derek would have appeared to be a loving stepfather who was deeply invested in the children's well-being and daily care. But Ruby knew better. She could see the performance for what it was, Derek's final preparation for the role he planned to play when social services investigators interviewed him about Carmen's parenting abilities. He was establishing himself as the responsible adult who had stepped in to provide stability and care when Carmen's work schedule made her unavailable. By 9 o'clock, both children were supposed to be in bed, and Derek settled into his usual spot on the living room couch with a beer and the television remote. But instead of his typical pattern of steady drinking throughout the evening, Derek seemed to be pacing himself, maintaining just enough alcohol consumption to appear relaxed, while staying sober enough to make coherent phone calls. Ruby lay in her bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, but tonight every creak and whisper seemed amplified and threatening. She had spent the day trying to think of someone she could call for help, but every option seemed to lead to complications that might make the situation worse rather than better. She could not call Carmen at work because Derek would hear the conversation and realize that Ruby knew about his plan. She could not call the police because she had no proof that Derek was planning to commit a crime, making false reports to social services was certainly wrong, but Ruby was not sure it was technically illegal, especially if Derek was careful about how he presented his concerns. She had considered calling Carmen's mother, who lived in a tiny apartment 2 hours away, but Ruby barely knew her grandmother and was not sure the older woman would believe such a complicated story from an 8-year-old granddaughter she rarely saw. Besides, even if her grandmother did believe her, what could she possibly do from so far away? The one person who kept coming to mind was Mrs. Patterson, the kind neighbor who had always shown genuine interest in Ruby's well-being and who lived close enough to potentially help in an emergency situation. But Ruby was not sure how to explain the situation to Mrs. Patterson without sounding like a confused child who was overreacting to normal adult conversations. At 11:30 p.m., Ruby heard Derek's phone ring, and she immediately crept to her bedroom, door to listen to what she feared would be his final planning conversation before making the call to social services. "Yeah, I'm ready to do this," Derek said, his voice steady and determined. "Carmen left for work an hour ago. Won't be back until 7 in the morning. The kids are supposedly asleep, but even if they weren't, there's no one here to supervise them except me, and I'm not their legal guardian." Ruby felt her heart begin to race as she realized that Derek was not just preparing to make the call. He was about to make it right now, hours earlier than she had expected, She had assumed he would wait until the middle of the night when social services emergency response would seem more dramatic and urgent, but apparently he had decided that late evening would be more convenient for his purposes. "I've got all the documentation ready," Derek continued. Photos of the kids' rooms showing inadequate living conditions. Records of Carmen's work schedule proving she's absent from the home 12 to 14 hours at a time. Notes about behavioral issues that suggest the children feel unsafe and unsupervised. Ruby realized with growing horror that Derek had been even more methodical in his planning than she had understood. He had not just been complaining about her and Miguel's presence in his life. He had been actively building a case against Carmen, manufacturing evidence that would support his claims about inadequate parenting and unsafe living conditions. "The beautiful thing is that Carmen will never suspect me," Derek said with satisfaction that made Ruby feel physically sick. "She'll think it's just bad luck. Or maybe that some neighbor got concerned about the kids being left alone so much. By the time she figures out what really happened, if she ever does, it'll be too late to do anything about it." Derek's conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which Ruby learned that he had already researched the specific social services office that handled emergency child removal cases, identified the particular complaints that would trigger immediate investigation, and even practiced the precise wording he would use to make his report sound credible and urgent. "I'm going to wait until midnight to make the actual call," Derek said finally. "That way it'll seem like I've been wrestling with the decision all evening, trying to decide if I should get involved or mind my own business. The internal conflict will make me sound more believable." When Derek ended the call, Ruby heard him get up from the couch and walk to the kitchen, presumably to get another beer while he waited for midnight to arrive. She realized with crystal clarity that she had approximately 30 minutes to act before Derek destroyed her family forever. Ruby slipped quietly out of bed and retrieved the tablet from its hiding place under her mattress. The photographs of Derek's text messages were still there, clear evidence of his plan to make false reports to social services, but Ruby knew that even with this proof, she would need help from an adult who could act quickly enough to prevent Derek from following through on his scheme. She looked out her bedroom window toward Mrs. Patterson's house next door, where a warm light glowed in the kitchen window. The older woman was probably having her usual late evening cup of tea and reading one of her mystery novels, completely unaware that a real-life crisis was unfolding just a few yards away. Ruby made her decision with the desperate clarity that sometimes comes to children who realize they must save themselves and everyone they love. Moving as silently as she possibly could, Ruby pulled on her jeans and sneakers over her pajamas, then grabbed the tablet and crept toward her bedroom window. The window was old and sometimes stuck, but Ruby had opened it many times during hot summer nights, when the house's ancient air conditioning system could not keep her small room cool enough for comfortable sleep. Tonight, the window opened smoothly and silently, letting in the crisp October air that carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the main road that ran through the center of Millbrook. Ruby looked down at the ground below her window, measuring the distance and planning her route to safety. The house was a single-story ranch, which meant Ruby's bedroom window was only about 4 feet off the ground. There was a small flower bed directly below the window that Carmen had planted with hardy perennials that were now dormant for the winter. And beyond that was the narrow strip of grass that separated their house from Mrs. Patterson's property. Ruby climbed carefully through the window, holding the tablet securely against her chest with one arm, while using her other hand to lower herself as gently as possible to the ground below. Her feet landed softly in the flower bed, and she quickly stepped onto the grass to avoid leaving footprints in the soft soil that might alert Derek to her escape route. The night air was cold against her face, and Ruby realized that she was shivering both from the temperature and from the adrenaline that was coursing through her small body. She looked back at her house, where the blue glow of the television flickered against the living room windows, and Derek's silhouette was visible on the couch. He was completely unaware that one of the children he planned to have removed from their home was currently standing in the backyard, preparing to expose his scheme to someone who might actually be able to help. Ruby crept across the narrow strip of grass that separated her family's property from Mrs. Patterson's yard, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The older woman's house was similar in style to Ruby's own home, but it was better maintained, with fresh paint and carefully tended flower beds that even in late October showed signs of the loving attention Mrs. Patterson devoted to her gardening. The back door of Mrs. Patterson's house opened onto a small covered porch where she kept her gardening tools and a collection of potted plants that she brought inside during the winter months. Ruby approached this door slowly, suddenly uncertain about what she was going to say, or how she would explain the complicated situation that had brought her to her neighbor's back door at nearly midnight on a school night. But as she raised her hand to knock, Ruby heard Derek's voice from her own house, slightly muffled by distance, but clearly audible in the quiet neighborhood air. He was talking on the phone again, and his tone had shifted to the false concern and reluctant worry that he had been practicing for his call to social services. "I hate to bother you so late at night," Derek was saying, "but I'm really worried about 2 young children who live next door to me. Their mother works overnight, shifts at a diner, and she leaves them alone for 12 to 14 hours at a time with no adult supervision." Ruby realized with a shock of terror that Derek had moved up his timeline again. He was making the call to social services right now, at this very moment, rather than waiting until midnight as he had originally planned. She had run out of time for careful planning or measured consideration of her options. Without allowing herself to think about how strange and frightening she must look, Ruby knocked firmly on Mrs. Patterson's back door. The response was immediate, footsteps approaching from inside the house, followed by the porch light turning on and the sound of a deadbolt being unlocked. The door opened to reveal Eleanor Patterson in her bathrobe and slippers, her silver hair released from its usual neat bun and her wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew from sleep. "Ruby?" Mrs. Patterson's voice was filled with surprise and immediate concern. "My goodness, child. What are you doing outside at this hour? Are you all right?" "Mrs. Patterson, I need help," Ruby said, her voice shaking with fear and urgency. "Derek is calling social services right now to lie about my mom so they'll take me and Miguel away from her. I have proof that he's lying, but I don't know how to stop him." Mrs. Patterson's expression immediately shifted from sleepy confusion to sharp alertness. She stepped aside and gestured for Ruby to come into her warm kitchen, where the promised cup of tea sat cooling on the table next to an open paperback mystery novel. "Show me," Mrs. Patterson said simply. And Ruby knew with profound relief that the older woman was taking her seriously, rather than dismissing her concerns as childish imagination or misunderstanding. Ruby turned on the tablet, with trembling hands, and showed Mrs. Patterson the photographs she had taken of Derek's text messages. As the older woman read through the evidence of Derek's plan to make false reports and manufacture documentation against Carmen, her expression grew increasingly grim and determined. "These messages show that he's planning to lie to social services about your mother," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with anger. "This is not just wrong, it's potentially criminal. We need to call for help immediately." "He's making the call right now," Ruby said urgently. "I can hear him from my bedroom window talking to someone about Mom leaving us alone and not taking proper care of us. If social services believes him, they might come take us away tonight." Mrs. Patterson moved with surprising speed for a woman in her late 60s, reaching for the cordless phone that sat on her kitchen counter and dialing 911 with steady, determined fingers. "This is Eleanor Patterson at 247 Elm Street in Millbrook," she said, when the emergency operator answered. "I need to report an adult who is making false claims to social services about child neglect. I have an 8-year-old girl here who has evidence that a man named Derek Walsh is lying to authorities in an attempt to have 2 children removed from their mother's care." Ruby could hear the calm, professional voice of the 911 operator asking questions, and Mrs. Patterson responded with clear, factual answers that made the situation sound both urgent and credible. She explained that Ruby had photographic evidence of Derek's plan, that he was currently in the process of making false reports, and that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent innocent children from being removed from a loving home based on fabricated claims. "Yes, I can stay on the line," Mrs. Patterson said. "The child is safe with me, but we need police officers here as quickly as possible to prevent this man from completing his false report to social services." As they waited for the police to arrive, Mrs. Patterson wrapped Ruby in one of her soft Afghans and prepared a cup of hot chocolate that Ruby was too nervous to drink, but grateful to hold for the warmth and comfort it provided. The older woman asked gentle questions about Derek's behavior and Carmen's work schedule, helping Ruby organize her thoughts and prepare to explain the situation to the police officers who would soon arrive. "You were very brave to come to me tonight," Mrs. Patterson said, placing a reassuring hand on Ruby's shoulder. "What you did took tremendous courage, and you may have saved your family from a terrible situation." Through the kitchen window, Ruby could see lights beginning to turn on in houses throughout the neighborhood as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. She realized that her desperate midnight escape had set in motion a series of events that would change everything for her family, but for the first time in months, she felt hope instead of fear about what those changes might bring. The police. Cars arrived with flashing lights but without the loud sirens that might have awakened the entire neighborhood unnecessarily. Ruby watched from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window as 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of her house, their red and blue lights painting the familiar white aluminum siding in alternating colors that made the building look strange and somehow unreal. 4 police officers emerged from the vehicles and approached the front door of Ruby's house with the confident, professional manner of people who had dealt with similar situations many times before. Ruby could see Derek's silhouette through the living room window as he answered the door, and even from a distance she could tell that he was surprised and confused by the unexpected late-night visit from law enforcement. "They're talking to him now," Mrs. Patterson observed, standing beside Ruby at the window. "The officers will want to speak with you shortly, so let's think about how you want to explain what you overheard and what evidence you have." Ruby nodded, clutching the tablet that contained the photographs of Derek's incriminating text messages. She knew that the next few hours would determine whether her desperate plan had succeeded in protecting her family or whether Derek's head started in calling social services would still result in the destruction of everything she and Miguel held dear. But for the first time since she had overheard Derek's initial phone conversation 2 nights ago, Ruby felt as if she was not facing the crisis alone. Mrs. Patterson believed her. The police were taking her report seriously, and the evidence she had gathered was being treated as credible proof of Derek's deception, rather than the confused imaginings of a frightened child. As the police officers continued their conversation with Derek, Ruby allowed herself to hope that her midnight escape through the bedroom window had been the first step toward saving her family, rather than the beginning of an even more complicated and dangerous situation. Whatever happened next, she had done everything in her power to protect Miguel and preserve their life with Carmen, and that knowledge gave her strength to face whatever challenges the rest of the night might bring. The next 20 minutes passed, with agonizing slowness as Ruby watched from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window while the police officers conducted their investigation at her house. She could see Derek gesticulating through the living room window, his body language suggesting confusion and growing agitation as the officers asked him questions about his phone calls and his relationship with the Martinez family. Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, had been the first officer to cross the yard and speak with Ruby directly. She had listened carefully as Ruby explained about Derek's plan, examined the photographs on the tablet with professional attention, and asked gentle but thorough questions about what Ruby had overheard during Derek's phone conversations. "You've been very observant and very brave," Detective Santos had told Ruby after reviewing the evidence. "These text messages show clear intent to make false reports to Child Protective Services, which is a serious crime. You may have prevented something terrible from happening to your family." Now, as Ruby watched the police activity at her house, Detective Santos returned from coordinating with her colleagues and sat down at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table with a small notebook and a reassuring expression. "Derek Walsh has been placed under arrest," Detective Santos said gently. "We found additional evidence on his phone that supports what you photographed, including recent calls to the Child Protective Services hotline and detailed notes about false claims he was planning to make about your mother's parenting." Ruby felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. "Does that mean he can't call social services anymore? Does that mean me and Miguel get to stay with Mama?" "That's exactly what it means," Detective Santos confirmed. "Derek will not be able to contact social services or anyone else about your family because he's going to jail. The charges against him include filing false reports, conspiracy to interfere with child custody, and several other serious offenses that will keep him away from you and your family for a long time." Mrs. Patterson squeezed Ruby's hand gently. "Your mother is on her way home from work. Detective Santos called the diner and explained that there was a family emergency that required Carmen's immediate attention. She should be here within the next few minutes." Ruby's relief was so overwhelming that she started to cry for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. All the fear and tension she had been carrying for the past 2 days seemed to pour out of her in shaking sobs that left her feeling both exhausted and strangely lighter. "It's okay to cry," Detective Santos said softly. "You've been dealing with a very scary situation, and you handled it better than most adults would have. But now you can let yourself feel all those emotions you've been holding back." While Ruby composed herself, Detective Santos explained what would happen next. Derek would be taken to the county jail and held pending his court appearance. The district attorney's office would review the evidence and likely file additional charges based on the detailed documentation of his plan to separate the Martinez children from their mother through false reports to social services. "Will we have to go to court?" Ruby asked, wiping her eyes with the tissue Mrs. Patterson had handed her. "Probably," Detective Santos said honestly. "But you won't be alone, and you won't have to face Derek. There are special procedures for cases involving children, and there will be people there whose job is to make sure you feel safe and supported throughout the process." A few minutes later, Ruby heard the familiar sound of Carmen's old Honda Civic pulling into the driveway, the engine making the particular rattling noise that always meant their mother was home. Ruby looked out the window and saw Carmen hurrying toward Mrs. Patterson's house, still wearing her pink diner uniform and looking confused and frightened by the police cars and flashing lights that had greeted her return from work. Detective Santos went to meet Carmen at the front door, and Ruby could hear the low murmur of adult voices as the officer explained the basic situation. When Carmen finally entered Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, her face showed a complex mixture of relief, confusion, anger, and profound gratitude that she was struggling to process all at once. "Ruby, baby, are you okay?" Carmen knelt down beside her daughter's chair and pulled her into a tight hug that smelled like coffee and French, fry grease and the familiar perfume that Ruby associated with safety and love. "I'm okay, Mama," Ruby said, her voice muffled against Carmen's shoulder. "Derek was going to call social services and lie about you so they would take me and Miguel away. But I heard him planning it and I got proof and Mrs. Patterson helped." "Me call the police." Carmen pulled back to look at Ruby's face, her expression showing amazement and pride alongside the lingering fear. "You did all that by yourself? You figured out what Derek was planning and you found a way to stop him?" Ruby nodded, suddenly feeling shy about the magnitude of what she had accomplished. "I was scared that if I didn't do something you might not be able to get us back once social services took us away." Carmen's eyes filled with tears as she realized how close they had come to losing each other, and how her 8-year-old daughter had been the one to recognize the danger and take action to protect their family. "I'm so sorry I didn't see what Derek was really like," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion and guilt. "I thought he cared about us, about all of us. I had no idea he was planning something so horrible." Detective Santos, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped forward to address Carmen directly. "Mrs. Martinez, I need you to know that Derek Walsh was very sophisticated in his planning and deception. He had been documenting what he claimed were problems with your parenting for weeks, and he had researched exactly how to make false reports sound credible to social services. Investigators, even experienced adults, might have missed the signs of what he was doing. Carmen nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. What happens now? Is Derek really going to jail? Will we be safe? Derek is being held on multiple felony charges, Detective Santos explained. Based on the evidence your daughter gathered and what we found on his phone, he'll likely be sentenced to several years in prison. There will also be a restraining order that prevents him from contacting you or your children in any way. Over the next hour, Detective Santos walked Carmen through the details of Derek's plan and the evidence that Ruby had collected. Carmen's expression grew increasingly horrified as she learned about the text messages discussing the best ways to make her appear to be an unfit mother, Derek's research into the foster care system, and his cold calculation about how social services investigations typically proceeded. He had it all planned out, Carmen said with a shudder. He knew exactly what to say to make it sound like I was neglecting my children, and he had been collecting what he thought was evidence to support his claims. The good news is that none of his manufactured evidence would have held up under investigation, Detective Santos said. Social services workers are trained to recognize false reports, and they would have quickly discovered that Derek's claims were unsupported by facts. But the process of investigation and family separation can be traumatic even when it's eventually resolved in the family's favor. Ruby realized that Derek's plan might not have succeeded in permanently separating her from Carmen and Miguel, but it could have caused weeks or months of family disruption, legal proceedings, and emotional trauma that would have affected all of them for years to come. Ruby saved us from all of that, Carmen said, looking at her daughter with an expression of profound love and respect. She recognized the danger before any of the adults did, and she found a way to protect our family. As the immediate crisis was resolved and the police completed their investigation, Ruby began to feel the exhaustion that comes after sustained periods of fear and adrenaline. Mrs. Patterson noticed her flagging energy and suggested that perhaps it was time for Ruby to get some rest, though she was welcome to stay in the guest bedroom if Carmen preferred not to return to their house immediately. I think we should go home, Carmen decided after a moment of consideration. Derek is gone, and we need to start reclaiming our space and our sense of safety. But Mrs. Patterson, I can't thank you enough for believing Ruby and helping her tonight. You may have saved my children. Eleanor Patterson smiled warmly, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the kitchen light. Ruby saved herself and her family. Tonight, I just provided a safe place for her to make the phone call she needed to make. But I want all of you to know that my door is always open if you need anything at all. Detective Santos provided Carmen with contact information for victim services, family counseling resources, and legal aid organizations that could help them navigate the court proceedings that would follow Derek's arrest. She also gave Ruby her business card and told her that she could call any time if she had questions or concerns about the case. What you did tonight was remarkable, Detective Santos told Ruby as they prepared to leave Mrs. Patterson's house. You showed incredible courage and intelligence, and you should be very proud of yourself. As they walked across the yard toward their own house, Ruby noticed that the police cars had gone and the neighborhood had returned to its normal quiet. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but Ruby knew that everything inside would be different now. Derek's belongings would need to be removed. The sense of tension and fear that had permeated every room would slowly fade, and they would need to figure out how to rebuild their family life without the constant anxiety that had characterized the past 6 months. Inside the house, Carmen immediately began the process of removing Derek's presence from their lives. She gathered his clothes from her bedroom, collected his toiletries from the bathroom, and packed everything into the same duffel bag he had brought when he first moved in. Ruby helped by identifying Derek's possessions in the living room and kitchen, feeling a sense of liberation each time they placed another of his belongings in the bag that would soon be out of their house forever. We'll have his things picked up tomorrow, Carmen said as they surveyed the living room, which already looked more like their own space without Derek's hunting magazines and beer cans cluttering the coffee table. I never want to see him again, and I never want his things in our house again. Miguel had slept through the entire crisis, which Ruby considered a blessing since her little brother would have been terrified by the police cars and the dramatic events of the evening. When he woke up the next morning and asked why Derek was not at breakfast, Carmen explained simply that Derek would not be living with them anymore because he had made some bad choices that meant he needed to go away. "Will he come back?" Miguel asked with the direct curiosity of a 5-year-old. "No, honey," Carmen said firmly. "Derek will not come back. It's just going to be the 3 of us from now on, the way it was before." Miguel accepted this explanation with the resilience of a child who had never been particularly attached to Derek in the first place. "Good," he said matter-of-factly. "I like it better when it's just us." Over the following days, as the immediate shock of Derek's arrest wore off and the family began to adjust to their new reality, Ruby found herself processing emotions and realizations that were too complex for her 8-year-old vocabulary to fully express. She felt proud of her courage and quick thinking, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had accomplished and the responsibility she had taken on for protecting her family. Carmen, meanwhile, was dealing with her own complicated feelings about the relationship with Derek and her failure to recognize the danger he had posed to her children. She started attending counseling sessions provided through the Victim Services Program, where she learned about manipulation tactics used by controlling partners and strategies for recognizing warning signs in future relationships. "I keep thinking about all the times Derek criticized you and Miguel, all the comments he made about how much easier life would be without children," Carmen told Ruby during one of their evening conversations. "I thought he was just adjusting to the idea of being part of a family, but now I realize he was never planning to accept you as part of his life." Ruby was learning to articulate her own understanding of Derek's behavior and motivations. "He wanted you to choose between us and him," she said. "But he knew you would choose us, so he was trying to make it so you wouldn't have a choice." Carmen nodded, her expression showing both sadness about her poor judgment and determination to never again allow someone to threaten her children's security. "From now on, anyone who wants to be part of our lives has to love and accept all of us, not just me. My children are not negotiable." The court proceedings that followed Derek's arrest were less traumatic than Ruby had expected, partly because Derek's attorney advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than going to trial. Ruby had to give a brief statement to the judge about what she had overheard and photographed, but she was allowed to do so in the judge's private chambers rather than in open court, with Detective Santos and a victim advocate present to provide support. Derek was sentenced to 3 years in prison followed by 2 years of probation, during which he would be prohibited from contacting the Martinez family in any way. The judge commended Ruby for her courage and intelligence in recognizing and documenting Derek's criminal plan, noting that her actions had prevented serious harm to innocent children and held an adult accountable for attempting to manipulate the child welfare system for personal gain. This case demonstrates that children are often more perceptive about dangerous situations than adults realize, the judge said during the sentencing hearing. Ruby Martinez showed remarkable maturity and bravery in protecting her family, and her actions should serve as a reminder that we must always listen carefully when children express concerns about their safety. As autumn turned to winter and the immediate crisis became a resolved chapter in their family's history, Ruby found herself settling into a new sense of security and normalcy that felt strange after months of hypervigilance and fear. She no longer lay awake at night listening for threatening adult conversations, no longer felt the need to monitor Derek's moods and drinking patterns, and no longer carried the weight of being the only person who understood the danger facing her family. Carmen had reduced her work schedule to a single job at the diner, accepting the financial challenges that came with lower income in exchange for being more present in her children's daily lives. The family qualified for some assistance programs that helped with expenses, and Carmen had started taking community college classes in the evenings to work toward a degree that would eventually lead to better employment opportunities. "We're going to be okay," Carmen told Ruby one evening as they worked together on homework at the kitchen table while Miguel played with his toy cars nearby. "It might take some time to build the life we really want, but we're safe now, and we're together, and that's what matters most." Ruby nodded, feeling the truth of her mother's words in a way that went deeper than intellectual understanding. They were safe, they were together, and they had learned that they could depend on each other and on caring neighbors like Mrs. Patterson when life presented challenges that seemed too big to handle alone. Most importantly, Ruby had learned that sometimes the smallest person in a family can be the one who recognizes danger most clearly and takes action most effectively. She had discovered strengths within herself that she had not known existed, and she had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when people you love are in danger. The house on Elm Street was still the same modest ranch-style home with thin walls and creaky floors, but it no longer felt like a place where Ruby needed to stay awake listening for threats. It had become once again what it was supposed to be, a safe harbor where three people who loved each other could build a life together, protected by their mutual care and supported by a community of neighbors who looked out for one another's well-being. As winter deepened and the neighborhood settled into the quiet rhythms of the season, Ruby would sometimes look out her bedroom window at Mrs. Patterson's house and remember the night she had climbed through that same window in desperate search of help. The memory no longer filled her with fear and anxiety, but with pride and gratitude, pride in her own courage and quick thinking, and gratitude for the adults who had believed her and acted swiftly to protect her family. She had learned that being 8 years old did not make her powerless, that having evidence and telling the truth to the right person could change everything, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust another person enough to ask for help when you cannot solve a problem alone. 3 months had passed since the night Ruby climbed through her bedroom window to seek help from Mrs. Patterson, and the house on Elm Street had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The most obvious changes were physical. Carmen had used her savings to repaint the living room a warm yellow that made the space feel larger and more cheerful, had hung new curtains that let in more natural light, and had rearranged the furniture to create a more open, welcoming atmosphere that bore no resemblance to the tense, oppressive environment that had existed during Derek's residency. But the more significant changes were emotional and psychological. The house no longer felt like a place where Ruby needed to monitor adult conversations for signs of danger, where Miguel needed to play quietly to avoid triggering anger, or where Carmen needed to walk on eggshells to prevent arguments that might escalate into something more serious. It had returned to being what it was supposed to be, a home where three people who loved each other could live safely and plan for their future together. Ruby had started the new year as a 4th grader. At Millbrook Elementary, where her teacher, Mr. James Chen, had noticed significant positive changes in her demeanor and academic performance. The hypervigilant anxiety that had characterized Ruby's behavior during the fall semester had been replaced by a more relaxed confidence that allowed her to focus on age-appropriate concerns like making friends, learning multiplication tables, and participating in the school's science fair. "Ruby seems much more settled this semester," Mr. Chen had told Carmen during their parent-teacher conference in February. "She's always been a bright student, but now she seems able to concentrate on her schoolwork without the distraction of whatever was worrying her before. She's also become more social with her classmates, which suggests that she's feeling more secure in general." Carmen had explained the family's recent crisis in general terms, describing Derek as someone who had created an unstable living situation that had now been resolved. Mr. Chen had nodded with the understanding of an educator who had seen many children struggle with family disruptions and who knew that academic improvement often followed the resolution of home-based stresses. "Children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe and supported," Mr. Chen had observed. "Ruby clearly has a strong foundation of family love and community support that has helped her navigate a difficult period. She should be very proud of how she's handled everything." The community support that Mr. Chen referenced had become one of the most unexpected and meaningful aspects of the family's recovery process. Word of Ruby's courage in exposing Derek's plan had spread quietly through the neighborhood, not as gossip, but as a story of inspiration that had strengthened the bonds between families who had lived near each other for years without developing deep connections. Mrs. Patterson had become an honorary grandmother to Ruby and Miguel, inviting them for afternoon tea and cookies, helping Ruby with challenging homework assignments, and teaching Miguel how to identify different types of birds that visited her backyard bird feeders. The older woman's house had become a second home where the children could go when Carmen was working, where they felt safe and valued, and where they were building the kind of intergenerational relationship that both Ruby and Miguel had been missing since their own grandparents lived so far away. "Mrs. Patterson makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world," Miguel had announced one evening after spending the afternoon next door learning how to play checkers. "And she says I'm getting really good at remembering which way the pieces can move." Ruby had developed a special bond with Mrs. Patterson that went beyond the gratitude she felt for the woman's help during the crisis. The older woman had a way of listening that made Ruby feel like her thoughts and observations were important, and she had encouraged Ruby to keep a journal where she could write about her experiences and feelings without worrying about grammar or spelling or making sense to anyone else. "Writing helps us understand our own thoughts," Mrs. Patterson had explained when she gave Ruby a beautiful hardcover journal with blank pages and a ribbon bookmark. "Sometimes we don't know how we really feel about something until we try to put it into words on paper." Ruby had initially been skeptical about journal writing, but she had discovered that Mrs. Patterson was right. The process of writing about her experiences helped her make sense of emotions that were too complex to fully understand otherwise. She wrote about her memories of Derek's threatening behavior, her fear during the nights when she lay awake listening to his phone conversations, and her pride in having found the courage to take action when her family needed protection. But she also wrote about happier things: Miguel's excitement about learning to ride his bicycle without training wheels, Carmen's smile when she came home from her new part-time job at the public library, and the way their house felt peaceful and safe in a way that Ruby could barely remember from before Derek's arrival in their lives. Carmen's transition to working at the library had been one of the most positive developments of the past 3 months. The job paid less than her previous position at Rosie's Diner, but it offered regular daytime hours, health insurance benefits, and the opportunity for advancement as Carmen continued her education. More importantly, it allowed her to be home. In the evenings when Ruby and Miguel needed help with homework, wanted to talk about their day, or simply needed the comfort of their mother's presence and attention. "I love working with books and helping people find information," Carmen had told Ruby one evening as they prepared dinner together. "It feels like I'm using my brain in ways I haven't for years, and I'm learning things every day that make me feel smarter and more capable." Carmen had also started attending evening classes at Millbrook Community College, working toward an associate degree in library science that would eventually qualify her for higher-paying positions with more opportunities for professional growth. The classes were challenging after so many years away from formal education, but Carmen approached her studies with the same determination she had always shown in providing for her family. Ruby often helped Carmen with her homework, reading through her mother's essays to check for spelling errors and offering suggestions about organization and clarity. It felt strange and wonderful to be helping her mother with schoolwork, and Ruby took pride in contributing to Carmen's educational success, the same way Carmen had always supported Ruby's academic achievements. "You're a good editor," Carmen had told Ruby after incorporating several of her daughter's suggestions into a research paper about children's literacy programs. "You have a good eye for what makes writing clear and interesting." The evening routine of homework time had become one of Ruby's favorite parts of the day. She and Carmen would sit at the kitchen table with their respective assignments, while Miguel played quietly nearby with his toy cars or worked on his kindergarten reading practice. The house would be filled with the peaceful sounds of concentration, pages turning, pencils writing, and the occasional question or comment about something they were learning. Miguel had also thrived in the months since Derek's departure. His kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had reported that he seemed more confident and outgoing, more willing to participate in class discussions and group activities. He had made several close friends and had been invited to birthday parties and playdates that filled his weekends with the kind of normal childhood social experiences that had been limited during the period when family stress made such activities seem impossible to manage. "Miguel draws pictures of our family all the time," Mrs. Rodriguez had told Carmen during their conference. "They're always very happy pictures. He draws the three of you smiling and holding hands, often with your house and a big sun in the sky. His artwork suggests that he feels very secure and loved at home." Miguel's security and happiness were perhaps Ruby's greatest source of satisfaction as she reflected on the events that had changed their lives. She had acted primarily to protect Miguel from Derek's plan, and seeing her little brother flourish in their restored family environment confirmed that her desperate midnight escape had achieved its most important goal. The legal resolution of Derek's case had concluded in February, when he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The judge had imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the law, citing the premeditated nature of Derek's plan and the potential harm to innocent children as aggravating factors that warranted serious punishment. Ruby had not been required to testify at the sentencing hearing, but she had been allowed to submit a written victim impact statement that described how Derek's behavior had affected her and Miguel. Writing the statement had been emotionally difficult, but it had also provided Ruby with an opportunity to articulate the long-term effects of living in fear and the relief she felt knowing that Derek could never again threaten her family's stability. "Derek Walsh made me feel like I had to protect my little brother and my mother from someone who was supposed to care about us," Ruby had written. "I had to grow up too fast and worry about things that kids shouldn't have to think about. But I learned that I'm stronger and braver than I thought I was, and I learned that there are good adults who will help children when they ask for help in the right way." Detective Santos had visited the family several times during the months following Derek's arrest, both to provide updates about the legal proceedings and to check on their emotional recovery. She had become something of a mentor to Ruby, encouraging her interest in understanding how the justice system worked, and suggesting that Ruby might consider a career in law enforcement or social work when she was older. "You have the kind of observational skills and courage that make for excellent police work," Detective Santos had told Ruby during one of her visits. "You noticed things that adults missed. You gathered evidence systematically, and you knew when and how to ask for help. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in good investigators." Ruby had been flattered by Detective Santos's encouragement, but she was still too young to think seriously about career choices. More immediately, she was focused on helping Miguel adjust to their new circumstances, supporting Carmen's educational goals, and rebuilding her own sense of childhood after months of carrying adult-level responsibilities and concerns. The rebuilding of Ruby's childhood had been facilitated by her renewed friendship with Jessica Martinez and several other classmates who had invited her to participate in normal 8-year-old activities like sleepovers, movie nights, and Saturday afternoon adventures at the local shopping mall. Ruby had initially felt strange about engaging in such light-hearted activities after the intensity of her recent experiences, but she had gradually rediscovered the joy of simply being a child without the weight of family crisis on her shoulders. "It's okay to just be a kid sometimes," Carmen had told Ruby when she expressed uncertainty about whether she should accept an invitation to Jessica's birthday party. "You've shown that you can be responsible and brave when our family needed you to be, but that doesn't mean you have to carry that responsibility all the time. I want you to have fun and make good memories with your friends." The birthday party had been a turning point for Ruby, marking her transition back into the normal social world of elementary school children. She had played party games, eaten cake with pink frosting, and participated in the kind of silly, giggly conversations that she had almost forgotten how to enjoy. Most importantly, she had felt like herself again. Not the hyper-vigilant protector of her family, but simply Ruby Martinez, a 9-year-old girl who liked art class and mystery books and sleepovers with her best friend. Spring had arrived, early in Millbrook, and the neighborhood had come alive with the sounds and sights of renewal. Mrs. Patterson's garden was showing the first green shoots of daffodils and tulips. The maple trees were beginning to bud, and families were spending more time outdoors after the long winter months. Ruby and Miguel had started riding their bicycles around the neighborhood again, waving to neighbors who were working in their yards and feeling the simple pleasure of being children who were safe and free to explore their community. One warm Saturday afternoon in March, Carmen had surprised Ruby and Miguel by announcing that they were going to Miller's Pond for a picnic, just like they had done the previous summer before Derek became part of their lives. They packed sandwiches and fruit and cookies that Mrs. Patterson had made, loaded everything into Carmen's car, and drove to the small lake where families had been coming for generations to feed ducks and enjoy peaceful afternoons by the water. "This is just like before," Miguel had said with satisfaction, as he threw pieces of bread to the ducks, while Ruby and Carmen sat on the picnic blanket watching him. "Except now it feels even better because I know Derek isn't going to be there when we get home." Carmen had laughed at Miguel's direct observation, but Ruby had understood exactly what her brother meant. The picnic felt like a reclamation of their family traditions, a return to the kind of simple happiness that Derek's presence had made impossible. They were not just having a nice afternoon by the lake. They were celebrating their survival and their freedom to create new positive memories together. "I want to come here every month when the weather is nice," Carmen had said as they packed up their picnic supplies. "We should have traditions that are just ours, things we do together that make us happy and help us remember what's important." The establishment of new family traditions had become an important part of their healing process. They had started having movie nights every Friday, taking turns choosing films and making popcorn together while they cuddled on the couch and commented on the stories they were watching. They had begun cooking elaborate Sunday dinners, with Ruby and Miguel helping Carmen prepare dishes they had never attempted before, and sometimes inviting Mrs. Patterson to join them for their culinary experiments. Most meaningfully, they had started volunteering together at a local organization that provided support services to families in crisis. Carmen helped with administrative tasks, while Ruby and Miguel played with younger children whose families were receiving assistance. The volunteer work allowed them to give back to their community while processing their own experiences through service to others who were facing similar challenges. "Helping other families makes me feel like what we went through wasn't just something bad that happened to us," Ruby had told Carmen after a particularly rewarding afternoon at the family center. "It makes me feel like we can use what we learned to help other people who are scared or don't know what to do." Carmen had been moved by Ruby's insight and maturity, recognizing that her daughter had developed a sense of purpose and social responsibility that went far beyond what most 9-year-old children typically demonstrated. Ruby's experience had taught her that individuals could make a difference in dangerous situations, that communities had resources available for people in crisis, and that courage could be contagious when one person's actions inspired others to get involved. The approach of summer had brought new opportunities and adventures for the Martinez family. Carmen had been accepted into a summer internship program at the county library system, which would provide valuable professional experience while allowing her to maintain her flexible schedule for childcare. Ruby had been selected for the school's Gifted and Talented program, which would challenge her academically, while providing enrichment activities that matched her intellectual curiosity and analytical skills. Miguel had been enrolled in a summer day camp that focused on outdoor exploration and environmental education, activities that would satisfy his boundless energy while teaching him about nature and conservation. Most exciting of all, Carmen had saved enough money for a week-long vacation at a lake resort where they could swim, hike, and participate in organized activities without worrying about expenses or time constraints. "This summer is going to be our best summer ever," Miguel had announced, while looking through the brochure for the lake resort. "We're going to go swimming every day and roast marshmallows and sleep in a cabin in the woods." Ruby had agreed with Miguel's assessment, but her excitement about their summer plans was tempered by a deeper appreciation for how much their lives had changed since the previous year. The summer before, they had been living under Derek's increasingly oppressive presence, walking on eggshells and avoiding activities that might provoke his anger or resentment. This summer, they were free to make plans based purely on what would make them happy and bring them closer together as a family. As Ruby reflected on the past year during a quiet evening in May while she wrote in her journal, she realized that her experience with Derek had taught her lessons about courage, community, and family that would influence the rest of her life. She had learned that children were capable of recognizing and responding to danger, even when adults failed to see threats that were right in front of them. She had discovered that gathering evidence and presenting it to the right person could change everything, even when the situation seemed hopeless. Most importantly, Ruby had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when people you love are in danger. She had been terrified during those nights when she listened to Derek's phone conversations and realized the extent of his plan to destroy her family. But she had found the strength to move forward anyway because the alternative, losing Miguel and Carmen, was unthinkable. The memory of climbing through her bedroom window at 2 a.m. would always represent the moment when Ruby discovered her own inner strength and resourcefulness. She had been just 8 years old, alone in a dangerous situation, with no guarantee that Mrs. Patterson would believe her story or know how to help. But she had taken action anyway, trusting her instincts and hoping that telling the truth to a caring adult would be enough to save her family. On a warm evening in late May, as Ruby sat on the front porch reading while Miguel played in the yard and Carmen tended to the small flower garden she had planted where Derek's truck used to leak oil on the driveway, Ruby looked across the yard to Mrs. Patterson's house and saw the older woman sitting on her own porch with her evening cup of tea and a mystery novel. Mrs. Patterson noticed Ruby looking in her direction and waved with the warm smile that had become such an important source of comfort and stability in Ruby's life. Ruby waved back, thinking about how different things might have been if Mrs. Patterson had not been the kind of person who would open her door to a frightened child in the middle of the night, who would immediately understand the seriousness of the situation, and who would know exactly what steps to take to get help quickly and effectively. "Ruby, come help me decide where to plant these marigolds," Carmen called from the garden, holding up a small flat of bright orange flowers that would add color to their front yard throughout the summer months. As Ruby closed her book and went to help her mother with the gardening, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the life they had built together in the months since Derek's arrest. They were not wealthy, and they still faced the normal challenges that came with being a single parent. Family in a community where resources were sometimes limited, but they were safe, they were together, and they had learned that they could depend on each other and on their neighbors when life presented difficulties that seemed too big to handle alone. The house on Elm Street was still modest and imperfect, with thin walls and creaky floors and all the minor maintenance issues that came with an older home. But it was theirs, and it was filled with the kind of love and security that Derek had tried to destroy, but had ultimately failed to damage permanently. Ruby had protected it by recognizing danger and taking action. Carmen had reclaimed it by removing Derek's presence and influence, and Miguel had filled it again with the sounds of childhood joy and innocence. As summer approached and the family looked forward to new adventures and opportunities, Ruby understood that the most important lesson from her experience was not about the specific tactics Derek had used or the particular way she had stopped him. The real lesson was about the geek power of family love, community support, and individual courage to overcome threats that initially seemed overwhelming and insurmountable. She had learned that being small did not make her powerless, that having evidence and telling the truth could change everything, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust another person enough to ask for help when you cannot solve a problem alone. These lessons would stay with her for the rest of her life, influencing how she approached challenges and how she responded when other people needed protection or support. The evening light was beginning to fade as Ruby helped Carmen plant the marigolds in neat rows along the edge of their front yard. Miguel had been recruited to water the newly planted flowers with a small watering can, and he was taking his job very seriously, making sure each plant received exactly the right amount of water to help it grow strong and healthy. "These flowers are going to be beautiful all summer long," Carmen said with satisfaction, as they stepped back to admire their work. "Every time we look at them, we'll remember this evening when we planted them together." Ruby nodded, understanding that her mother was talking about more than just flowers. They were creating new memories to replace the difficult ones from the previous year, building positive associations with their home and their life together that would eventually outweigh the trauma they had experienced during Derek's residency. As they gathered up their gardening tools and prepared to go inside for dinner, Ruby took one last look around the neighborhood that had become such an important source of safety and support. The streetlights were beginning to come on, casting gentle pools of light along Elm Street, where she had once run in desperate search of help. Other families were visible through lit windows, going about their own evening routines of dinner preparation and homework supervision and bedtime stories. It was an ordinary neighborhood filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, but Ruby now understood that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary kindness when circumstances required it. Mrs. Patterson was an ordinary widow who had chosen to open her door to a frightened child. Detective Santos was an ordinary police officer who had taken a child's report seriously and acted swiftly to prevent a crime. Carmen was an ordinary single mother who had found the strength to rebuild her life after recognizing that she had made a dangerous mistake in trusting the wrong person. Ruby herself was an ordinary 9-year-old girl who had discovered that courage and intelligence could overcome threats that seemed much larger and more powerful than she was. She had learned that families could survive crisis and emerge stronger, that communities would rally around people in need, and that telling the truth to the right person at the right time could literally save lives. As they walked toward their front door, Ruby felt profoundly grateful for the ordinary evening they were about to spend together. Dinner around the kitchen table, homework time with Carmen's gentle assistance, bedtime stories that Miguel would request, and Ruby might help tell. These simple, peaceful moments were precious because she now understood how easily they could be lost, and how much courage and determination were sometimes required to protect them. The house welcomed them with warmth and light as they stepped through the front door, closing behind them with the soft click of a lock that now provided security rather than trapping them with danger. Ruby looked around the living room with its cheerful yellow walls and comfortable furniture arranged to encourage conversation and togetherness, and she felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Outside, Millbrook settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, unaware that the small house on Elm Street had once been the scene of a crisis that could have destroyed a family, but had instead become a story of courage, community, and the unbreakable bonds of love that make ordinary people capable of extraordinary things when the people they care about most are in danger.